Hi, my name is Don Daglow, and this is Starting Your Project, Studio, and Business Right. And I want to thank the organizers of GDS for inviting me to give this talk to you today and for setting up this stream and the conference. So, to give you a quick background on what I've done in the past to kind of form the ideas for setting up businesses and starting projects, I've actually had the chance to be making games for just under 50 years. I started as one of the lucky college students who got access to computers to make games in the very early 70s, which meant I then in turn got to get into the industry in the very early days, first with Mattel's and television, and then with a startup called Electronic Arts that worked out pretty well. And then also ran my own AAA console and online studio, Stormfront Studios, for 20 years. And for the last 12 years, I've been an independent advisor to publishers and indie teams and all sorts of game development projects, trying to help people in a wide variety of settings. So that's what I've been doing for the last few decades. So if you're thinking about starting a project, a studio, setting up a team, we have this tough problem of, where do I start? And here in this photograph, we've got kind of a desert-like sandy beach, and we've got one person by themselves, and it feels wild. And I think that the desert island is a great place to be starting this discussion, because I think that thinking about going to a desert island is a great way to think through how you want to set up the first part of your project. And I'll kind of fill that in. The first topic, so this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So the first topic is the who. Who are you going to work with on your project? With whom do you want to go to a desert island? Perhaps for a long time. Number two is the GRU that kills most teams. If you haven't ever read about GRUs, it's a creature from the early days of games, and you can look it up. It's a fun story. Number three is how we go about setting up projects for new companies. Number four, mutability and what to do about it. Well, Mutability is a poem written over 200 years ago by Percy Bysshe Shelley, but in fact the idea is one that all through the Renaissance and into the modern era people talked about a lot. It's not a term you hear much anymore, but it's actually a very important idea for game development and game developers, and I'll try to make sense out of that. Number five will be the keys to great teams, and these are ideas it took me 35 years to finally start to feel like I had an understanding of. I'm a very fast learner. And then point six is fighting with yourself, and I'll try and explain that issue and explain what that means. Before we start with anything, I want to start with this one idea that money does not automatically make success, happiness, fulfillment. There are projects you may want to do where you're doing it for the love of the game. It's a small game. You may be students. You may be working in your spare time. You're not trying to make money. You're just working out of a love of the game. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. If you start thinking about money, though, I want to make sure you're thinking about money as a way to get to the goal. The goal is to build a great game. And if people start out with money, if I do this, I can make money. I'm going to create a new battle royale game. Well, if you had the idea for a battle royale game a few years ago, that would have been a great idea. But now you'll just be one of 50 copycats coming out this month. So that idea, it's too late for that idea. So when you think about money, we tend to think about being copycats. When we think about building great games, we tend to think about originals. And that, ironically, is where money comes from. So very often, if this is our profession, if we are professional game developers, as I have been for so long, you have to think about where the money comes from, but you need to start by thinking about the great game first. Then we think about where does the money come from. When you form a team, then money starts to get involved very often, not always. And this is kind of an equation that I like to remind people about, and that is that money, which I'm expressing here as euro, times team equals still a question mark. Because having money and a team does not automatically say, okay, well, now we're going to make some money. Well, you're going to make whatever that original money you have is. But just having money and a team does not guarantee you of people liking your game, of wanting to buy your game. It doesn't guarantee anybody will give you money. It may create an opportunity to build a game, and that game may bring you money. But I want to emphasize that these are things that are at risk. These are not knowns. These are not automatic. We are taking risks. And the point is to make informed risks, handle risk well, and run a project as something that has risks, not as something that's just automatically going to work out. And we'll talk about a lot of the details of this in this talk. So here we are on the desert island, and of course the first question is, who do you want to go with? Who do you want to bring to your desert island? Maybe you're going to be there for a year, and people could starve and die. This is important stuff. So we want to bring the right people to our island. So the first question to think about, who gets the ticket? Who do you want to bring with you? And if you have a group of people, maybe you have a group of friends or students, you've worked on a project, you get along together, you work well together, and you're thinking about actually starting a studio and trying to get money and make this your work. Well, does every member of that group qualify as somebody who should be part of that studio? You may be friends with and really like everyone in that group. But if you're trying to build a great game, does every one of those team members have a role? Is there something they can do that personally makes a game great? These are tough discussions, part of many tough discussions we have to have at the start of projects, because you may have people you like a lot, but even if it's only at the start of the project, you do not need them to start the game. What they would do in any case comes later. And so having them at the start of the project, certainly you don't want to spend money there, because that money, whatever money you have, you need to spend very carefully. And one of the things I've seen teams do is start by bringing the whole group, and you start paying people money. You've got some money saved up, or you've gotten a little bit of money from a publisher to start a project, and you start handing out that money, and the money goes away. It gets spent very, very quickly. And if you're spending money on people who there isn't really something important for them to do yet in your project. And the way we plan at the beginning of projects, there's only a few important things to do. We don't need a big group yet. You can run out of money much faster than you thought and never have anything. So not only who do you want to bring to the island, but who needs to come right at the start to do the planning, the pre-production, the design, the creation of samples of everything. Who needs to do that as opposed to who will eventually be needed on the project? And now if they have a ticket to the desert island, what terms are written on that ticket? Is there money? Are they getting money to come to the desert island? It's very important. We tend, especially if you're working with friends, it's easy to say, we'll just start working, we'll figure it out. But that can lead to misunderstandings later. And even if we assume that everybody involved, everybody you're working with, leaders of the team, other people on the team, everybody's fair, honest, has good intentions, there are still misunderstandings. And when you don't talk about it in detail carefully at the start, those misunderstandings can actually break apart a team. They can lead to lawsuits. If you've seen the movie about the founding of the social network, about the founding of Facebook, you'll see a great example of misunderstandings and legal fights and everything when that became a big deal. So by agreeing at the start for each team member, are they going to be paid at all? Is anybody going to get paid? What will they get paid? And if this is a new business, who owns part of the business and who does not? And those are sometimes uncomfortable talks, which is why we want to postpone them and put them off. But having those discussions at the start prevents a lot of troubles later. Now, some people you don't want to bring on desert island with you, and I was thinking about this because, like a mad king, if we're just being joking around a little, we'd say a mad king is someone you would not want a desert island with you because they would always have their own agenda. They'd want to do what they want to do. As an American, I was trying to think of a great example of a mad king, and I couldn't quite come up with one. So I keep thinking about it. I don't know, but I couldn't think of an American Mad King. So I'll bring up the Mad King Disney always uses or implies. Mad King Ludwig of Bavaria. We'll say whatever kind of Mad King we're talking about, somebody who is like that, you do not want in a startup. You don't want in your studio. You don't want included. Even if away from work, you like them, you have fun with them, you'll go out with them for a beer. They could be your friend, but you know that they are toxic, dangerous, and destructive if you're trying to do something serious. You may also not like them, but that doesn't matter. It's a matter of who will help the team, who will help build a great game. And so even if you like somebody, if they're part of the group, if they don't operate well as part of a team, a football team in the World Cup is not going to do very well if you've got a midfielder who does whatever he wants to do. And this is true whether you're in sports or you're working on any kind of a project together. If you were working on a film, if you're working on musical or dance performance, if a person is not collaborating with the team, you don't want them. So picture whatever mad king you want to, but we don't want them in the project. So where to start? I think that thinking about the desert island is a very useful metaphor. You can even have this discussion as an exercise with your team if you want to, or you can just do it in your imagination and think about it. But think about, how do people handle things? Okay, we're going off to a desert island. If we don't find enough food, we could starve. This is dangerous stuff. Things could go very badly. We have to decide things like, we're going to build little huts. We have to have some shelter to survive. If you guys were on your desert island and the people you're planning on starting your studio with are all talking about this, is everybody talking about it collaboratively? Are you one group of equals kicking it around? You may have leaders, but is everybody sharing ideas? Is everybody listening to each other's ideas? How is that discussion going? How do you feel, if you're the team leader, about how that's going? Is there a team member who's kind of off on their own? No, it can't be like that, can't be like that. Well, they may be giving us good ideas and the rest of us have missed something, or they may be a mad king. We don't know, but we have to think about this. So who decides where the huts are located on the island? Who decides who gets to live in each hut? What if there's one hut that has a view of the ocean and none of the other huts have a view of the ocean? It sounds petty and I'm being silly about my example, but these issues come up as teams get bigger. So, and do different groups form among your founders? And some of them want huts on the beach, and some of them want huts on top of a hill. You need your team to be able to resolve disputes, resolve arguments as a team, agree on something, and then do it everybody together, working together. So either in your imagination or even if you're just fooling around with an exercise, thinking about how the people you want to start with would handle a life and death situation like this is good to think about. And if you see individuals or groups who just want to start out dividing or stepping out or controlling, those are people you probably should exclude from your startup, from your studio, from your team, even if they are a great programmer or a great artist. If they're going to do more damage than good, if you had somebody repair your car or your house, you would never pay them money to do more damage than repairs. When you're starting out with a team, why would you ever pay a person who's going to damage the team money to do so? And you have to have the discipline to not take that wrong person. So, second topic, the GRU that kills most teams. So picture a mythical monster. And that is, most teams fail. Most startups of any kind of company, any business, any industry fail. So if most fail, there are patterns about why game teams fail that we can learn from, and we can use them to try and make it less likely that we fail. We can make our own success more likely by looking at some of these common patterns. So I'm going to share some of those with you. Now, before we talk about those patterns, there's a couple of issues I want to raise. One is deadlines. And we're used to thinking of deadlines as something that somebody else gives us. Here's a deadline, do this by this time. But sometimes we give ourselves deadlines. And sometimes that can be useful. So here's a very personal example of a one-person project. So this is just me with me. These are both books I wrote. On the right is The Fog Cellar, is a novel I did as a little background passion project. I worked on it late at night. Once in a while on the weekend, I'd put it down for 3 months, 6 months, not do anything, come back to it. I finished the novel. It turns out it was successful. But it took me 7 years to write the book because I had no deadline. It was a background activity. I did it when I had time. On the left is my indie games book. It's part of a 2-book set I wrote on this theme. And when I set out to write this book, I worked on it for about 3 months. And then I accepted an offer to give a presentation to an important group in 4 months. And that meant when I accepted that invitation, that meant that I had to have the book done in 4 months. So I accepted, I gave myself a deadline. I wasn't forced to do this. I could have said, no, I want to wait and do it later. But no, I accepted the deadline. I finished the book. It's also been successful, but I wrote it in 7 months. So what's the difference between these two? They're both books I loved writing. They were both books that were important to me. But one book took 7 years to write because I didn't give myself a deadline. One book took 7 months to write because I did. Some things in life you don't want a deadline. And I'm not advocating that you put deadlines in everything. But it's good to understand that deadlines are not always the enemy. Sometimes they're our friends. And figuring out when and when not to use them is important. Some game projects have their own built-in deadline. So if you're getting paid to do a game, there's a certain amount of money and a certain amount of time. So the money represents a deadline. If you were doing a World Cup football game, well, the World Cup happens on schedule at a certain time. And from even the preliminaries, you want to have your game online in the stores available before the World Cup tournament even starts. That's your sales window. That's when people are thinking World Cup. That's when people are going to want to buy your game. So that's a deadline of a sort. If you're working with a movie project or a TV show related, something like that, you have deadlines. When the movie, you have to be in the stores, you have to be online when the movie comes out, ideally at least 2 weeks ahead of that. So you have a chance to get distribution. When people start thinking about the movie, your game is already available. And I use this example of Tron just because I designed the 2 of the consumer games behind the original Tron movie almost 40 years ago. Ironically, that was a movie which was late and had to cut its spec because it was late, an issue we're going to talk about for games shortly. So deadlines like this can come just as part of a project, very common. So when I think about where teams have trouble and where a lot of teams have failed, it almost comes down to one of these fill-in-the-blank sorts of exercises, which sometimes can be both funny and sad at the same time. And so if you look at this, you may already have a project where you look at this and you go, oh, I've got one of those. I could fill it in right now. Don, you don't need to tell me about this. I've got my own experiences to fill in here. If you don't, or even if you do, you may talk to some of your games industry friends about this blank and share stories about how it happened and how you were aware of it. So I want to share some examples today, and then we'll talk about, in each case, what are some simple and basic ways that you can structure a project to avoid that problem or reduce the risk. Very often we can't eliminate risk, but we can reduce it. And if we keep working at reducing risk, and you do that over and over again, it can make big differences in your project. So here's example number 1. By the way, these are all fictional, if they have any basis in truth, I've changed them enough so that it's not anybody's confidential information. And I've been part of projects that had a lot of different kinds of problems like this because it happens all the time in games. So first one, we used up 5 months of our 12-month schedule, and we realized we'd never be able to make pathfinding work. Pathfinding can be a tough problem. So we had to cut the wilderness levels of our game, but of course, wilderness levels are what we were excited about, what we really loved. We'd been working on all the wilderness levels. The city parts of the game, pathfinding's easy with a network of streets. In the wilderness, with rocks, trees, weird terrain, it's hard. In the city, we could do it, but we weren't as excited about the city. We haven't done any work on it. So now you've done lots of work, but on all the wrong stuff, which unfortunately happens all the time. We had day jobs, we're working on the game at night, the team fell apart, everybody got discouraged and left. That really sucked. Every one of these stories, the ending, the tagline is, that really sucked. And that's what we don't want, is for everything to turn out in a way that sucks. So as one example here, this comes out of engineering, but it's true of all the disciplines in games. If you have an especially tough problem in your project, whether it's doing a certain kind of animation or a certain mechanic or a certain part of the code, put that first, right at the very start of the project, and don't spend money on a bigger team. Have the smallest possible team working on that problem and solve that problem. Once it's solved, the biggest risk in the project vanishes or is reduced, and now you can proceed. If you wait to just work on the risk, oh, I'll have it next month, just a few more weeks, and we'll have it done, then you can get where you get halfway, two-thirds of the way through the project, and you have a fatal problem like this. So in this case, what we'd want to do is take pathfinding, and it's in so many projects, it's a very complex problem, put that right up at the beginning of the project and just start getting that problem solved. And if you look anywhere in your project and you have a deal killer somewhere, if this doesn't work, we don't have a game. Great. We like putting easy things first and then work up to the hard. No. Start with the really hard thing, and then once it works, we get rewarded doing things that are easier. Okay, sample number 2. We used up 6 months of our 9-month schedule this time, and we realized our game was too hard for most mobile players. For those of us who come out of console games, we're used to an audience that wants more challenge, and we have to introduce that challenge relatively quickly to please our audience. Mobile players are a very different tradition. Even if they are also console players, they're only playing for a few minutes at a time. There are hundreds of thousands of games in the App Store. We can very easily lose their attention, and if we don't catch them quickly, if the game seems too hard, they're away. They want to know they can learn it, and learn it quickly. This problem happens all the time, especially teams coming from console to mobile. I've been involved in this issue in different ways working with teams. So in this case, had to throw out all the advanced levels of their animations, only had a few levels the players liked, we were running out of cash, had to lay off half the team, crunched for 4 months, finished the game, it was only okay, we were still late, it really sucked. All right, how do we avoid that? Play testing as early as possible, and not just with our friends and family, but getting strangers play testing as early as possible. Whatever is the core loop of the game, the core mechanics, the things that are fun, that will draw people most to our game, getting some kind of sample of that gameplay in people's hands very quickly, and seeing that strangers who are typical consumers, typical players on that platform, that genre, that type of game, that they get it and it's fun. And I will tell you, most of the time, I'm on a project right now where I just got a report back and feedback on an initial play, and here are some things that we thought were easy to understand. No, they weren't easy to understand. Okay, we got to go fix it. That's normal. That's why we do it at the start, because it is normal and it happens on most projects. But we want to find what those problems are right at the start so we can fix them at the start. not discover them once we've spent a lot of the time and a lot of the money, and now it's, what are we going to do? Because that really sucked. Okay, our third example. Now we've used 10 months of our 18-month schedule, and we realized it was twice as big a game as we could ever build. I have done this. I think most designers have done this. We tend to think big, and then you kind of get into it and you realize that this is way bigger than I could ever build. Okay, here's what we can build. In this case, you had to cut 2/3 of the levels. We'd done 25% of everything instead of 100% of some things. Our publisher killed the project, studio closed, and our kids had to change schools because we had to move, and that's where I could get a job. Sometimes the consequences of our mistakes go beyond just our project and our team. Families can be affected. And so this is something we don't want to do. If we needed any more motivation not to have these problems, stories like this, which happen all the time, are things that should motivate us to want to avoid these problems. So here, there's a couple of things. Number one, assume that your original specs are going to be oversized and that you're going to have to cut them. That's why we start with the most important stuff, and we're ruthless. Agile, as a project management system, does a great job with this. We assume we're going to have to be ruthless with what we start with the most important things, because we know we won't get to everything. So that's an attitude that if that pervades your planning process, you do the most important things first, and you assume that, it's a great vision, but some of it's going to at least have to wait, and some of it you may never do. But you're going to prioritize and keep doing the most important things. The other thing to remember is doing part of lots of things is nowhere near as useful as doing certain very important things and getting at least a solid first version of them going. In this case, if they had been creating their early levels, they could have been figuring out the scoping problem, and they still would have something to work with, and maybe the project wouldn't have been canceled. So those are important to think again about. Okay, our final example. After this, I could give you 100 of these, but we'll deal with 4. Let's see, here we used up 11 months of our 18-month license, and then we discovered that our publisher, who had been saying all along, we've got the deal coming, the contract's not quite done, but we've got it, don't worry, we're proceeding, we're going to have Star Wars. And then we discovered that they never signed the Star Wars license, and they were never going to be able to sign it. And there are many variants on this story, but if there's no contract and it's not signed, there's no deal. And you can lose a lot of money and a lot of time working with publishers when the license never comes through, or with a license that you're acquiring on your own. So here I had to cut. Well, if you're building a Star Wars game and suddenly it's not a Star Wars game, we know what's going to happen. Darth Vader, throw him out. The Death Star, no. Millennium Falcon, no, get rid of it. Hans, oh dear. And here, in our example, the producer threatened to sue us, which, even when it's a publisher's fault, can happen. And we finished on time. We crunched for too long for an ordinary game, and that really sucked. So the key here is no deal is done until it's signed, until it's complete, until the first payment is made. Whether it's publishers promising money, whether it's a licensor, whatever's being promised, until there's a signed contract and the money is in our hands and we see it's all on paper, we can't count on it. This team was told by the publisher it's okay to start a project, and they were getting paid. But later it turned out there really was no project. The publisher now turned on them and was nasty. They had a very bad experience. They didn't make any money, and they didn't produce a great game, and they didn't produce something they're proud of. So we always want to wait for contracts to get signed before we commit. And it's another example of things that can take teams down. So the moral of all these stories is don't go here, don't go someplace that turns out to be the dead end in the middle of the jungle or the desert. So if we sum up some of the ways to think, I've talked about the specifics of these examples, but general ideas to sum this all up. Don't spend art money, programming money, any kind of money on a game very much of it, and don't spend much time until you see that your core mechanics, your key of the game, whatever it is people spend most of their time doing that's fun, you've proven out that it is fun, and people in this genre, on this platform, want to play this kind of game. And you may do a lot of work mocking up a very, very small sample of the game in order to test this out. Most alpha games, most first mock-ups of game ideas don't work very well. The norm, even for games that turn out to be big hits, is that the first versions are flawed. It's what you do after that that makes you a game designer. Everybody's got ideas. It's when you implement the first part of the idea and it's not really all working. That's when real game design starts. So you don't want to spend a lot of money until the real game design is starting and you're proving to yourself you have something that's fun, not just to friends, not just to family, but to strangers. And then the second is to use Agile or some other kind of system to track your progress. And then every week, and on a big project, maybe every 2 weeks, asking yourself and asking the members of your team, is it fun, and is there any place we're falling behind? And if it's not fun yet, and if you're falling behind, you don't wait a month, you don't wait 3 months, you don't wait 6 months. You immediately take action. In all of these teams, if right at the start when something was not happening or was going wrong, somebody had said, wait, time out, we need to do something here, we're going to start to fall behind, everything wouldn't have gone wrong. They would have gone to doing the most important thing. They would have held up and not proceeded until the Star Wars license was in hand, whatever it was. But people didn't stop. So stopping yourself and saying, we need to fix this now, that way you can get a little bit behind, but you can't get so far behind that everything's going to suck. And we're going to talk about some more details behind that as well. That brings us to the how. So here's our lone person on the desert island wondering how. So we said about pick a process, whether it's Agile, Scrum, Kanban. I don't think jobs to be done is very good for games in terms of trying to manage a project or define a project. But as an exercise at the very beginning of the design of a game and thinking about art direction, all these things, I think it's a great exercise for a team at the start. It's not a project management system overall. I personally don't believe that Waterfall is anywhere near as good, as effective a system as things like Agile in Kanban, but everybody has their own opinion. Your personal adaptation you can pick, but you'll notice I'm saying adaptation, that if you know something works and you make your own few individual adjustments to it, and those also work, that's great. What we don't want to do is pick a broken system. And I'll give you some examples of what I think are broken systems. Kind of Agile. Many times on teams that are struggling, are late, they're not meeting deadlines, that are missing features. If you talk to the team and say, okay, what's your project management system? How do you organize things? Oh, well, no, we do Agile. Oh, okay, you do Agile. And so how do you have your Scrum team set up and so on, how you define your sprints? And they say, oh, well, we don't really do all that stuff, but we have stand-ups. We have stand-ups all the time when we talk about what we're doing. Well, all by itself, stand-ups are useful. It's good communication. People know what's going on. But that's only a small part of Agile or some of the other kinds of systems that are project management. Those are the really easy parts that don't require commitment and follow through and follow up. So when you're doing that, I think it's helpful, it's a good thing, but it's not a project management system and it won't keep you from falling behind. So I think of that as kind of Agile, and I think kind of Agile is dangerous because team leaders are reassuring themselves that they're managing things and everything's okay, but there is no real project management going on. So that's dangerous. Another example of a system that does not work, I call The Sopranos. The managers threaten everybody all the time. If you don't do this by this date, you're fired, to put in jail. That's not a great system. Nobles and peasants. There are lots of deadlines, and there are lots of to-dos, and there's lots of accountability for most people, but the nobles in the kingdom don't have any real accountability or deadline or obligations or anything they've said that really committed to doing. They're just kind of there doing what they want to do. So most people on the team feel like peasants. And I've read a lot of history and seen a lot of films and read books about what the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were like. And I would tell you, in almost all those stories, the peasants are unhappy and angry. Being a peasant is not something we like being. So if you set up a nobles and peasants system where there's a lot of management for most people, but some people are just kind of floating through, the peasants very often aren't happy and leave, and it turns out if your peasants are really talented, that could be the end of your studio. So that's a bad idea. And then finally, if you have your personal brilliant new project management system, totally unrelated to anything anybody else has ever done, I will tell you, on the first project where you ever try it, it will probably fail because it's this wild new idea. So I discourage people from doing that. Once you have successfully shipped a product under a system and not had major problems where it served you, adapting that system, I think, is fine. So before I leave the how, and we've talked about picking a system and using it, there's one other story I want to put in here, one other key point, because this is something I always include in any talk I do about starting a project or a studio if money is involved. And if money is not involved, it's still a good thing to know about life. And that is the 3 kinds of cash. I was taught this by a mentor at the very beginning of when I founded my first company, and boy, did it help me. So that's why I've always tried to share it with people ever since. Because we think of cash as cash. Okay, we've got this money. But we don't really have this money because not all cash is the same. So there's cash you don't have to give back. Well, Don, of course there's cash you don't have to give back. I mean, what are you talking about? Well, because there's cash you have to give back. For example, if you buy something on a credit card, you are promising to pay money. And so you may have cash in the bank, but you also have that credit card bill, and at some point you're going to have to pay it, and it's going to grow interest until you pay it. So indirectly, that's an example of cash you have to give back. And oh, by the way, if your business bank account is in the same bank as your personal bank account for your family, first of all, if you don't pay the credit card bill and it gets too old, the bank can take money out of your bank account to pay the credit card bill. And that's money you are now giving back. It's cash you didn't really have. Every country and jurisdiction may be different in this, but in most places in the world, you can't just take the money and not pay it without a consequence. And if your personal bank account is in that same bank and your company bank account doesn't have money, if you read the fine print when you signed up for the credit card, the bank can go into your personal bank account and take the money to pay off the credit card because you haven't paid it for too many months. So that's one example of cash you may have to give back. If a publisher is giving you advances for a project, look at your contract. You want to make sure those advances are non-refundable. Some publishers will say, well, if this happens or that happens, you have to give us back those advances. Well, now that's not cash. It's not cash you don't have to give back because it says in the contract you have to give it back. That's why in contracts you always want to make sure all the money you're given is non-refundable. And if the contract doesn't directly say it's non-refundable, they can try and go back for it, and they may even have a clause. If this happens, you have to give the money back. Well, that can create lots of trouble. So there's cash you don't have to give back, and now we've defined this new class of cash that you may have to give back. And once you start running a business, there are lots of places where there's cash you may have to give back. Finally, there's cash you have not yet received. And I've often sat down with teams and, money is short, and so they're looking at money, and somebody will say, okay, here's the money we have coming in. Here's some bills we have to pay. Okay, they're looking at money that could go out. Here's the money we have. And they'll say, and, we're positive that by August 1st we're going to get this money from someone. And that's cash you haven't yet received. They will then put that money on their spreadsheet because they're positive they're going to get it August 1st. But it's not cash. It might be a promise to give you cash. Promises can be broken. It may be an intention to give you cash. Sometimes people have intentions, and it turns out they can't just follow through. They don't have it themselves. So money you don't have, cash you don't have, is never cash. It's a promise that may not be kept. We hope it will be. It's a good intention that may not be fulfilled. And when we put these numbers that don't really exist, that's not really cash in our spreadsheets, it starts to look like cash. We keep spending money, and then if that cash is 30, 60, 90 days late, or if it never comes at all, suddenly we have a terrible problem. If you never count on cash other than cash you have in hand, and you may know, you may be working, you may be very optimistic, very hopeful money will arrive, but it's not cash until it arrives, until you have it in your bank and you have it as money that you don't have to give back. That changes how you look at money. In some ways it's sad because it's very cynical, but anyone who's running a business, even if you're only dealing with honest and ethical people, money will get paid late. Money may never be paid at all if somebody goes out of business. You can't count on any cash until it's in the bank. So if you think of that way, what do you do? If you look at this list, you'll be really careful with cash. And that's because if you run out of time, sometimes you can change. You can make your project smaller. You can get an extension. If you run out of computers, you can get somebody. You can borrow a computer. You can switch somebody's duties around so two people work at different times. Somebody can work from home. If you run out of cash, your business almost always closes very, very quickly. There's no exception. There's no forgiveness. And so that's why we have to manage cash carefully. That's what I was taught by a mentor when I started my first company. Boy, did it help me survive and run that studio for 20 years. So that's why I share it with you. One final point on that I want to share is a reminder. I put, as game developers, we share the savannah with carnivores. There are lions and other meat-eating animals out there. I think most people in the industry work at being honest, at having integrity and being trustworthy. But there are people in publishers who will take advantage of developers, who will cheat, who will create pressures, who will seem to offer something and then take it away. And I've learned it's better to assume that in any deal you have to get it all in a contract. You have to get normal protections, normal honest dealings and rules written down in contracts, rather than just assuming and just trusting. Because even if you completely trust the person you sign a deal with a publisher, 2 years later somebody different may be running that deal and they could interpret a contract very differently. And so for that reason, just always remember to be very cautious because there are meat-eating animals out there in the game's savannah, and we can't ignore that fact that some people will cheat and some people will take advantage. So I raised the point about mutability at the start and mentioned that it was a subject that's been discussed for hundreds of years, all through the Renaissance and into the Romantic era. And so for games, what does mutability mean? And the historical idea behind it is simply the concept that everything changes. Whatever we're looking at over time, it will change. So in Renaissance poetry, it's about we start as babies, we become children, adults, and then we grow old. It's about the leaves come out in springtime, the flowers bloom, then in winter the leaves fall, everything kind of gets gray, and then the next spring it happens again. It's constant change. So in games we have to understand that we also have constant change, and if the games industry seems very stable right now to you, which probably isn't the case, but if it did, yes, all the platforms are the same, the popular genres have stayed the same for a long time, the way we build games, all these things, everything's the same. Online's the same, distribution's the same. Then you might start thinking about development as being like the right-hand picture. It's just a train track going straight onward, always the same. Never changing, no change necessary, no planning. Everything's just fine. Do it the same way forever. And of course we know that's not the case. The games industry constantly changes, and it isn't just console generations. We have product genres, types of games, delivery systems, the way that online games get delivered, the onset of things like VR. Whatever it is, there's constant change. And after 50 years of doing this, I'll tell you, the rate of change is getting faster. So if you have a mindset of, I've made a plan, I'm all set, everything is stable, I'm going right down this tunnel on my rails, I'm on rails, we're just following the plan and everything's fine. That doesn't work very well in the games industry, because mutability, the idea that everything always changes, is how the games industry really works, and it's changing faster and faster. So the example I like to point out is the TV show in the UK, Doctor Who. That show has been canceled how many times? It's gone away, then it comes back. There have been 13 different Doctor Whos. If the organizers, if the producers of Doctor Who had expected everything to go forward and then, it fell apart, we got canceled. If they gave up at that point because they think, okay, nothing ever changes, that's it, we'd have one Doctor Who, not 13. But these guys are a great example of saying, okay, well, we'll rethink it, we'll bring it back. These are not people, whoever is producing Doctor Who at any moment is not picturing a world going on into the future unchanged, marching perfectly. They understand mutability, the idea that everything always changes. And so they are working within that change and being citizens of change and then adapting to that world. So if you find yourself or your team planning as if we're all on rails going down the straight line, I will tell you, as a long-time games industry veteran, you want to think like the people on Doctor Who are just assuming stuff will change, will have to adapt, and embrace that, love that idea of change. That's why you can be a game maker for 50 years, still love making games and not get bored, because it's always changing. We have to learn how to do new things, and we have to do new things. One other thing, too, that comes in with this is we think, but I made my plans, I had my ideas and stuff, and we fall in love with our games. The game I'm working on right now, I love the design. I'm so thrilled. But of course, things change. And we have to remind ourselves, especially as creatives, that carving in stone is the last step. It's not the first step. So this building, a lot of planning and a lot of discussion and argument and trying things out happened before they ever carved the stone in the front of the building. The artist who cast the bronze statue of the soldier had a lot of different drafts of what it might look like, models, showing it to people, getting discussion. It's only at the very end that everything gets frozen in. We have to accept that there will be change, stuff will evolve, so stay open to change, growing, adapting, evolving until that last moment we freeze things in. That's one reason I like to say to people that wikis, or wikis if you prefer, as discussion elements and ways to share a design and share the current reference on any kind of game development, the design docs, all the other samples, is a great way to go. If one designer gives you a list of commandments, this is what we must do, these are the game pillars, this is how we must do them, this must be blue, this must be red, and it's all one person to everybody, it doesn't work as well because you can't handle all the change, the discovery of issues, great new ideas. So all this comes together, the acceptance of mutability, constant change, evolution, instead of carving in stone, carving in stone, carving in stone. So it's an attitude as much as anything. So we've talked about a lot to think about, and I've got just a couple of things left to go over. One of them is the key to great teams, and it's really the keys. And I joke about it, but I've gone through lots of theories about this, and it was only about 35 years into my career working with great people that it really started to crystallize for me. So I will say I had a lot of other ideas before I got to these, although these have served me pretty well for quite a few years now. So the first of those ideas is hire great people. Well, Don, that's kind of obvious, I would say. Well, it is. But how often, we talked about, you're starting out a project, you got a group of 5 friends. 2 of them are nice people, but there's not something great they do in a game, in game building. They're pretty good, but they're not great. Well, if you have people who are not great at what they do, it makes it much harder to build a great game. If you hire great people, they're going to be devoted to that idea, and the odds of you building a great game just went way up. Oh, but I couldn't find that person. I needed to get somebody. I wanted a warm body. Just get me anybody who can do something. No, that ends up subtracting from the team, not adding to the team. You wouldn't pay money to make your car run worse instead of better. Why would you pay a weak team member to get in the way on your team and slow things down and mess things up, instead of finding somebody great who will make things run better? So being devoted to this idea of hiring great people is very important. The second idea is leaders listen. You've heard me talk about through all these other points. Have a discussion. Be listening. Use a wiki instead of commandments. All these kinds of ideas of listening and discussing with your team that involve listening. You've heard that all through. I think that's vital. A leader who just wants to talk, especially in modern game development, is not going to go very far. And then the third point is, boy, how many times have you heard me say this in this talk? Build a game you're proud to ship. Because this is a stream, we could probably go back and count. I may have said it 18 times. I don't know. But it's a vital point. The minute you start saying, oh, it's okay to do something that's pretty good, that's the enemy of great. Good is the enemy of great. We want to bring in people who are fanatical about building great games and have the skills to do it. We want to be devoted to building great games. We're not just surviving, we're prospering, we're doing something we're proud of. 20 years from now, people are going to come up to us at conferences or events and say, oh, I loved your game you did 20 years ago. That's a great feeling, I can tell you. To get that feeling, you have to be devoted to building something great. Those 3 secrets for me are the keys to great teams, and that's what I boiled it down to in my mind. And all of these ideas were ideas that were given to me by great people I worked with. So I wish I could tell you I was smart enough to do it all myself, and I wasn't. As I'm nearing the end of this talk, I do want to mention and give photo credit. There's a lot of really nice photos in this talk, and other than movies and posters and book covers and things like that, they all come from a gentleman named Bradley Gordon, and this is the connection information for him, and I happen to really respect his work. So my final point was about arguing with ourselves, and as a basis for this, when I was a kid, I loved to play this game. This is a very American game. I'm a huge baseball fan. I've done lots of baseball games. And when I was a kid, for years, I played this game over and over and over again. I saved the notes on the outcomes of over 2,500 different times I played this game. And those were just the ones that were written down. So I was a nut about this game. When I was 15, I was so crazy about it, I actually redesigned the game and made it better. But of course I thought, I'm a 15-year-old kid. I mean, I'm not going to say, oh, here, Mr. Big Game Company. I'm a 15-year-old kid, and I redesigned your game that was designed by a professional, a grown-up. And here's my great design idea. Yeah, right, they're going to care about what a 15-year-old kid says. So, of course, I didn't try. I didn't do it. So when we think about our ideas, a lot of times we argue with ourselves, and we say, oh, well, that's a good idea, but nobody's ever going to want to listen to me. Who would listen to me? I'm just a guy, I'm just a person. And we think that only we are thinking like this. I will tell you that powerful and important men and women across the industry, if you talk to them and ask the people who are now very well known and prominent, and you say, did you ever discourage yourself? Did you ever talk yourself out of doing something great that you could have done? Did you struggle with that? Ask Will Wright. Ask Sid Meier. Ask any of the famous designers. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of them. They will all tell you, oh yeah, oh yeah, I still discourage myself all the time. I will tell you, I discourage myself. And then I have to go, no, I'm not 15 years old. And even when I was 15, I should have sent them my ideas because my ideas worked. The same ideas I would have sent them became the basis of video games I later made that were successful video games. So the whole point is, if I go down one slide at a time, I want to remind you it's not about the money, it's about the love of the great game. We start with that, not thinking about money. But yes, you can. If you have a great idea, if you have a dream, if you have a great game you want to build, when that little voice inside your head starts telling you, no, nobody'd ever want to listen to you, nobody want your game, nobody want to work with you, nobody want to do this. Yes, you can. It may not be great, it may not work out, but you at least have to try, you have to start, give yourself the chance, even if it's just you doing something all by yourself in your spare time. That book I talked about, 7 years, one person, spare time, still worked out. So don't talk yourself out of trying. No one can guarantee success. But if you're doing something you're proud of, if you're building something great, you get to do that. You deserve to do that. You have the right to do that because you are trying to do something great that is authentically you. And I, more passionately than I can say anything else in this talk, I want you in this situation to try, because even if nothing ever comes of it, you gave yourself the chance, and what you have to say may turn out to be something very, very important. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for watching the stream, watching this session. Thanks again to GDS for inviting me, for the honor of being here. This is my contact information with my email address and also the link to my website for my game development work and also for my books. And I wish you happiness, success, and I wish you great games going forward. Thank you so much.